Ted looked at the number written on the paper, and his eyes grew large. This was way more money than he had made in a year, and this guy was offering it to him for... So, what do you want to pay me for, exactly? The man in the black suit stared at him hollowly, from behind his mirrored sunglasses. He sat nonchalantly across the table in the small coffee shop that Ted had written in for the last 4 years. Ted liked the ambience here, and many of the local writers seemed to think it was a great place to read as well. Ted could see many others around him, plinking away on their MacBooks or off-the-shelf Walmart laptops as they wrote the next great American novel or the next hit screenplay. The longer the man sat there, the more Ted wished he had approached one of them instead. "It's very straightforward," the man said, his voice in cadence reminding Ted of Agent Smith in the Matrix movies. "We want to pay you for your talent. You come to our office, let us see your talent, and we pay you for it. Sounds like something you might be interested in?" Then he smiled, his lips sliding away from his perfectly artificial teeth, and Ted cringed all over. It was like a dog who'd been taught to smile, unsettling and a little alarming. But it was a lot of money. "Let me think about it," Ted hedged, and the smile slid mechanically from the man's face. He produced a business card, rising suddenly and holding it out. "Let us know if you change your mind. The offer's valid whenever you're ready." He left then, making his way for the door like a shark hunting for its next meal. Ted looked at the card and wrinkled his eyebrows. It was a plain white business card, nothing fancy, with the words "Libris Talent," because your talent should never go to waste. Ted looked at it for a while as his laptop screen went into sleep mode, darkening and allowing him to see himself as he sat in contemplation. How very curious. Ted had been writing in some form or another for his whole life. When he was a kid, he drew pictures and created games for his friends to play. Ted's pictures, his mother swore, always told a story, and his games were never the haphazard mess that his friends often concocted. People who weren't even part of Ted's friend circle often came to join their games, and they were both fun and engaging in a way that was hard for a child to explain. His teachers praised his creativity and expected that he would do great things one day. As Ted grew, so grew his stories. By the time he was in middle school, Ted's work with fantasy was often entered into writing contests and local student work projects. His playground games had evolved into role-playing games, and when Ted was 12, he discovered the fantasy world of Dungeons & Dragons. He began a lifelong love affair with the game, and he took to the role of game master quickly. Ted's campaigns were immersive, his characters engaging, and his adventures never fell victim to the problems his friends usually encountered. Ted wrote well, and again, the adults in his life often praised him, expecting great things from him in the future. It had been a no-brainer for Ted to start studying writing after high school. He had soared through what is normally a very trying time for teens by channeling his churning emotions into his medium. Ted had gotten more than one scholarship for writing, and as college loomed, he put all of his efforts into his work. Ted spent the next 4 years working on a BA in English and Literature, and in the end, he felt he had the expected tools to begin plying his craft professionally. Now, however, Ted was trying to figure out how to turn his talent into a paycheck so he could pay his bills. Magazines liked his work, but wanted a writer with more experience. There were people online who would pay for his stories, but not enough to live off. Agents were interested, but they didn't want to take a chance on someone so young. Ted's writing was always well received, but there was always the ever-present "but" hanging at the end of all those praises. A few interested publishers had approached him, but it was always the sort that buried the line of price amidst all the talk. Ted was 26, 4 years out of college, self-published, untried, and no one was willing to take a chance on him. No one except Libris Talent, that was. Ted Googled them, of course. He had been burned too many times before and wanted to see what he was in store for if he decided to take their offer. Their website was professional, but ultimately soulless. Their credentials were numerous, but were presented without any real pride. This soulless corporation wanted another book for their accolades, another pet writer for their trophy case. If Ted signed on with them, he would be just another soulless shill who writes for nothing but a paycheck. Ted's phone buzzed. He looked down and sighed as he saw a message from the power company. His check had bounced again, and they were going to shut his power off at the end of the month if he didn't come up with some kind of money. That likely meant that Mr. Capish, his boss at the gas station, had given them bad checks again. He would never admit it, and this likely meant that Ted wouldn't get paid until the end of the month. He looked at the card. Or maybe he'd be able to keep the lights on after all. Ted nervously checked his phone to make sure he had the right address. He had come to a 2-story stucco building that looked more like a distribution center than a publishing house. Ted had worn his best interview clothes, a polo and a pair of slacks, and he already felt underdressed and unsure of the situation. The outer facade bore a simple sign, white and stark, just like the business card, Libris Talent. Ted thought about leaving, but the call of the money was too much to resist. The woman behind the counter wore a similar smile as he walked in. She was looking at the door as though expecting him, and her pantsuit and coiffed hair made her look assembled rather than styled. Ted was taken aback by her smiling regard, and he almost left again. The waiting area was as stark as the outer facade, and the receptionist's regard made him feel like he had been marked. Had she been staring at that door the whole time, just waiting for someone to come in? "Hi," Ted said. I'm looking for—" "Welcome, Mr. Dreff. Mr. Seraph is waiting for you in the back. Please go right ahead." She pointed to a door to the left of the waiting room, and Todd walked hesitantly toward it, his strange feeling growing with every step. Behind the door was a long hallway of offices, names neatly stenciled on the doors. Mr. Seraph's door was the third in line. Ted knocked, and a voice from the other side invited him in. Mr. Seraph sat behind his desk, the too wide smile stretching his lips painfully. "Mr. Dreff, I'm so glad you decided to accept my generous offer." Ted sat across from the grinning man, feeling like Faust as he met with the devil. "Well, it was too good an offer to pass up, I guess," Ted said. "Why, yes. The money is a fine incentive, isn't it?" Ted shuffled in his seat, not liking the man's regard. "So, how does this work exactly? Do I have to write something for you, or—" Ted blinked as a contract appeared on the desk. Mr. Seraph was leaning over the desk, too, that smiling face of his, a little too close for Ted's liking, and he handed him a heavy silver pen. Had that contract been there the whole time? Ted sat back a little, that too wide smile putting him off as the man leered at him. "What's wrong? I thought you were ready to sign." "I am. I'm just curious about what's involved in this," Ted asked. "Show us your talent, and we pay you for it. Couldn't be simpler." Ted looked at the contract, unsure of whether to sign or not. He'd heard of writers getting sucked into these unfair contracts before. He didn't fancy being someone's pet writer, his talent milked for God knew how long. Ted looked down at the contract, but it wasn't particularly helpful either. They offered to pay him for his talent, but that was all it said, really. It was very vague, not really saying anything other than that, with a lot of industry speak in between. As Ted hesitated, though, the money loomed up in his mind again. That was a lot of money, enough to live comfortably for quite a while if he was careful. No matter what they had him do, that kind of money could change his life. And even if it were repetitious or degrading, he'd still be doing what he loved, right? Ted signed the contract and pushed it back to the smiling man. Mr. Seraph made it disappear before the ink was even dry, and Ted was left holding the bulky silver pen in his numb fingers. "Excellent. Now come with me so we can assess your talent." Mr. Seraph rose from the desk and led him out of the office. Ted followed wordlessly, still not quite sure what to expect. The long corridor slid past as they walked, and the sameness was a little disorienting. Mr. Seraph stopped outside of another nondescript door and held it open. Inside was a stark white room, cluttered only by a desk and a pin in one of those ornate pin holders you often saw at weddings. Mr. Seraph nodded to the desk, indicating that Ted should sit. "What do you want me to do?" Ted asked, still hovering in the doorway. Ted wasn't sure he wanted to enter that unblemished space. "Just take up the pen. It'll know what to do from there," Mr. Seraph said, still grinning that troubling smile. Ted hesitated a moment longer before walking inside, the door slamming like a coffin lid behind him. Ted took a seat. On the desk was a single piece of paper, unblemished, and as he looked at it, he could swear that the surface moved. He didn't want to touch it, but it seemed to beckon him to nonetheless. He reached out for the pen, that instrument of creation, and it felt very right in his hand as he lifted it from the holder. He set the tip against the paper, and again, he thought it moved. What was he meant to do here? What was he meant to write? Show them his talent? How was he meant to... The pen came down on the paper, its tip blotting the surface as though through magnetism. Suddenly, Ted was writing. He was writing words, crafting stories, spilling ideas as the paper drank them down before his eyes. He spilled days, weeks, years' worth of stories onto the paper as he wrote. His hand cramped, his wrist ached, but still the merciless pen took his words. The paper drank greedily, swelling as he worked. Ted's vision swam as he felt his words dragged out of him, sucked from his body, and he felt certain that he must die. The paper swelled as he wrote, becoming sheets, a novel, a towering juggernaut of pages. The room began to fill with pages, pressing against the ceiling and bulging against the walls. Ted was powerless to stop his hands from writing, but soon the pages began to block out the light, and he wrote in a state of darkness. The pages pressed at him from all sides, entombing him in written word, and yet he wrote. When he finally passed out, it was a blessing. Ted woke up in his bed, his arm throbbing, his fingers and hands feeling like rubber. But when he tried to move, he found that they were asleep. He shook at them, thinking that maybe it had just been a weird dream. He had written himself into a literal tomb, and as he looked at his arm, he almost thought he could see blisters on his fingers. He sat down at his computer, looking through his emails for job offers, when he came across a new email from Libris Talent. He thought it strange, considering that he had just been dreaming about them, and now they were sending him a message. He figured they wanted to make him another offer for his talent, whatever the hell that meant. He opened it and read through the email, confused as he read the contents. Dear Mr. Dreff, we would like to thank you for your talent. Please find enclosed the payment for your talent. We hope you are satisfied with the transaction. Regards, Mr. D. Seraph. Ted read the email repeatedly before opening the app on his phone linked to his bank account. Ted's eyes went wide when he saw the amount in the account. He goggled at it in disbelief. It hadn't been a dream after all. He had sold his talent, he guessed. Ted grinned as he thought of the possibilities. Mr. Seraph had been right. This amount of money could indeed be life-changing. Ted sighed as he stepped back through the door to his apartment. He'd been on a 2-week vacation in the Bahamas, spent those 2 weeks in the lap of luxury, too, and still hadn't made a dent in the amount of money Mr. Seraph had put in his bank account. It was a sobering feeling, being able to do whatever you wanted, living life that few ever dreamed of. Now he was back, though, and he supposed it was time to get back to work. The money was nice, but it wouldn't last forever. The news feed on his computer pinged to let him know that one of his favorite authors had just released a new book. Ted opened the link and looked at the book, but he felt a strange surge of confusion as he read over the synopsis. It was a new novel, not like anything the guy had ever wrote before. A world of high fantasy, a tale of adventure set in the world of Eridar, where the lords of the hunt sought the prince of... Ted was astonished. That was his story. He'd been fleshing out the concept for years, and his manuscript was almost ready for submission. He had been so close to sending it off. Well, maybe in a couple of years he would have. He had just been getting it ready before he sent it off. He wanted to make sure it was perfect. The manuscript. Ted had the manuscript saved on his Google Doc. Ted furiously opened the browser, putting in his information as he brought up the account. It would be time-stamped, dated. He could take it to the proper people and prove that his work had been stolen. He couldn't believe that something like this had happened to him. He had read about this sort of thing happening online, but he never dreamed that it would happen to him. It was unthinkable, impossible. His Google Doc was empty. The screen was devoid of content. He pulled open the drawer next to his desk, searching desperately for a thumb drive he kept there as a backup. The drawer was also empty. Ted searched the computer for traces of his manuscript, his stories, anything at all, but they had all been erased. Ted had begun to panic then. What had happened? Someone had been in his apartment. Someone had stolen his work. Someone had taken his talent. Ted combed through his emails, searching for the email from Mr. Seraph. It, too, was gone. Nowhere to be found. It was as though he had never actually spoken to anyone. He found Mr. Seraph after 3 weeks of stalking the coffee shop. He had gone down to the building that had been Libra's Talent, but it was abandoned. The doors were locked, the sign was removed, and the building looked empty and forlorn. It had been too big of an operation to simply close up overnight. He had asked the people in the building about it, but all of them had just shook their heads, saying they didn't know anything about a talent agency or a publishing house. That was when he had taken to stalking the coffee shop. The place was always packed, and if Mr. Seraph was looking for other writers to swindle, he might come back there. He'd brought his laptop the first few times, but had finally just stopped. He was too distracted to write these days, after finding out his life had been stolen, and all he thought about was having his work returned to him. He'd spent the last 3 weeks drinking coffee and keeping his eyes peeled. He arrived when the place opened, and he didn't leave until the final customer had shuffled out. It was just after sunset on Tuesday when he found him. What we're looking for is your talent. Ted swung his head around sharply. The man at the adjoining table was talking to a blonde girl that Ted had seen hanging around lately. She was working on a screenplay, he thought. Working hard, it seemed, and it seemed that she had gained the interest of Libra's Talent. She looked over at the business card and told him she'd think about it before leaving in a hurry. The man sat for a moment, watching her leave, before turning to look at Ted. "Mr. Dreft, I hear you've been looking for me." Ted jumped, not sure what he would say, as Mr. Seraph came sauntering over to his table. He sat in the empty seat, his too wide smile making Ted cringe as it always did. He took a sip of the cold coffee that Ted had left there and seemed to be waiting for him to speak. Ted still wasn't sure how to begin this encounter. In his head, Ted had always been indignant, downright angry, but now as he stared into that too wide smile, he felt unsure of what he was doing. "I assume that you're here to talk about your talent. I must say, when it hit the bestseller list, I was shocked. I suppose we could reassess your price if you're looking for more money." That lit the fire in Ted again. "I want to know exactly what the hell you think you're doing. You break into my apartment, you steal my work, clean out my hard drive, and then you think you can just bribe me with more—" "I did no such thing," Mr. Seraph said, rolling his eyes. "We paid you for your talent. Your talent was writing. You signed a contract and were compensated handsomely." "Wait, you mean you paid for my stories?" Mr. Seraph scoffed. "Stories? Mr. Dreft, have you tried to write since you woke up in your bed?" Ted thought about it. Had he written anything in the past 2 weeks? Had he even felt compelled to write anything? He had signed his name to a few things, maybe written a text or two, but other than that, he hadn't written so much as a sentence creatively. He'd been having so much fun that the need hadn't arisen, and that should have worried him. The writing was what Ted did. Without it, his life was empty. That's right. You sold your talent rather cheaply, too, Mr. Dreft. But your kind usually does. You cut your goose open too quickly and find nothing as valuable as what you had. So what is Libra's Talent, then? You sell ideas to other writers? Mr. Seraph scoffed again. "Ideas? You're still thinking too small. Do you think that talent is something that just lasts forever? Talent is a finite resource, Mr. Dreft. It flows and ebbs. Some people are lucky enough to have a large tidal pool, but some people have to buy their talent to supplement. Libra's Talent finds those in need of talent, literary, athletic, political, what have you, and we get talent for them." Ted's blood ran cold. "So, I'll never write again?" Mr. Seraph looked a little sad. "Sorry, kiddo. Looks like you're just gonna have to live your life like one of these other talentless schlubs. But hey, if you ever decide you want to buy some talent, do keep us in touch." He left a business card on the table and made his way out. Ted sat there, hearing the click of the keyboard and the creation of raw ideas as they went on around him, and put his head in his hands. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Well, this is actually the first For Your Talent story, but some of you will remember that this is not the first appearance of our friend Mr. Seraph. I'm sure there will be many more talent stories to come, so if you enjoy them, keep an ear out. Speaking of enjoying, if you enjoyed today's story, I invite you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button and that notification bell. That way you don't miss any of the spooky tales we concoct here. As many of you know, I have a new story every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, with a few compilations mixed in, just for good measure. Before we sign off for the evening, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to The Irish Devil for being our Spooky Ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks to Xaronana, Emily Coltsfoot, and Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributor. And thanks to Glen Jenkins for being our Ghost Rider tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you get your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video I do, and you get your spooky a day early on a Tuesday and a Thursday. Patrons also get to suggest stories, as long as the writer's okay with it, for my Monday readings. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and take advantage of all the great stuff we've got here. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.